Hey, I'm Chris with Tactical Aviation. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to be going over Class G and E airspace. It'll be a tricky subject for a lot of drone pilots, but it's very important. This is where you're going to be spending most of your time flying. So it's pretty important that you understand everything that we're going to cover today. For those of you that don't know me, I started drone training about 15 years ago. I trained to be a drone pilot with the military, and I did that for about 5 years. I got trained on a couple different models. I flew on the Shadow, the RQ-7 Bravo, and I flew on the Gray Eagle as well. And so once I got out of the military, I picked up a couple contractor jobs where I started training other people how to be pilots. So I traveled the United States training up on the Special Forces and National Guard. So anytime a unit would get new equipment, I would fly to their location. I'd spend a couple months with them and I'd do platform instruction, simulator training, and flight line operations with the entire goal of making that unit self-sufficient so they wouldn't need any outside resources. I trained a lot at the schoolhouse down in Arizona as well, trained thousands of drone pilots on how to fly using the simulators or on the actual flight line. I trained foreign military, worked a lot with Customs and Border Patrol. So eventually I wanted to design more and more courseware because the military had contracted out to get a lot of the courseware developed. So I worked on some of these larger products and we developed some really great courseware that's in use by the military even today. So I found that there was a great need to have this UAS training just for the general community. So that's when I helped to start Tactical Aviation. So we train specifically now on your Part 107 requirements. A large amount of airspace over the United States is designated as Class E or Class G airspace. This provides sufficient airspace for the safe control and separation of aircraft and drones. Class E airspace is the controlled airspace not classified as Class A, B, C, or D. Class E airspace is the most common type of controlled airspace. And then Class G airspace is the uncontrolled airspace not classified as A, B, C, D, or E. It's pretty much everything else. And that's where drone pilots are going to do most of their operations. ATC has no authority or responsibility to control air traffic in Class G, and that's why they call it uncontrolled. A drone pilot would not need ATC authorization to operate in Class G airspace. Your Class G airspace extends from the surface to the base of the overlying controlled airspace. So you're going to do most of your operations in Class G. You're going to fly below 400 feet AGL unless you have a waiver. Class G is not going to be depicted on any sectional charts. So what you're going to do is you're going to find the floor of the Class E airspace, and you just have to know that your Class G airspace underlies it. Class G airspace within the United States extends up to 14,500 MSL. And then above that altitude is going to be Class E. Excluding the airspace that is less than 1,500 feet above the terrain. All right, so we see in this example, the mountain goes above that 14,500. So that would be Class G, and the Class E airspace is going to surround that. It's rare to find any Class G airspace that extends from the surface up to 14,000 feet MSL. Most of the United States has overlying airspace that starts at a lower altitude. And generally, that's going to be about 1,200 feet AGL. Class E typically extends up to, but not including 18,000 feet MSL. And then all airspace above flight level 600 is Class E airspace as well. Sectional charts are going to depict all locations of Class E airspace with bases below 14,500 MSL. And you're going to see that mostly at 1,200 AGL, 700 feet AGL, or at the surface. In areas where charts don't depict any Class E base or a Class E floor, your Class E is going to begin right at 14,500 MSL, right? In some areas, the Class E airspace base is at 1,200 feet AGL, and that's actually going to be the most common. So airspace that begins at 1,200 feet AGL that laterally abuts uncontrolled airspace or Class G airspace is depicted on a sectional chart by a faded blue line. All right, so on this light side of the faded blue line, your Class E floor is 1,200. On the dark side of that faded blue line, your Class E floor is going to be 14,500 MSL. And then everything under your Class E floor is going to be Class G. Right, so on the light side, 1,200 AGL. On the dark side, 14,500 MSL. Most of all Class E airspace within the United States has a floor of the 1,200 feet AGL. So look at this example on the sectional chart. You have your faded blue line, right? Lighter side or the outside of that faded blue line, your Class E floor starts at 1,200 feet. And then on the darker side or on the inside, your Class E floor is going to start at 14,500 feet MSL. So you can fly at 400 feet above a structure without a waiver and without ATC authorization if the structure extends into that type of Class E airspace. So Class G is going to be going up to 1,200 feet AGL in that entire area we're looking at. And then on the darker side of those faded blue lines, your Class G airspace is going to extend upward. And it's always going to stop at the floor of your Class E airspace, which is 14,500. So in between that Class G area is where your Class E area starts. So the lighter side, 1,200 feet AGL, and it's going to go up to 14,500, where then it turns into the entire area being Class E. So we have to look, why is that area so bizarrely designed? Well, it's because you have to think of it as the entire area is Class G, but there's going to be federal airways going through it. Federal airways, which are shown as these blue lines on sectional charts, are found within Class E airspace. And the federal airways start at 1,200 AGL and go up to, but not including, 18,000 MSL. So these federal airways cut straight through that Class G airspace. Those federal airways have a width of 8 nautical miles. It's 4 nautical miles on each side of the center line. All right. So as you can see here, it cuts straight through that Class G, and it makes that really interesting pattern on your sectional chart. In other areas, your Class E airspace base or floor is going to be 700 feet AGL. So you have Class E above 700 and then Class G below that 700 feet. So the airspace beginning at 700 feet AGL that laterally abuts 1,200 feet or higher Class E airspace is depicted on a sectional chart by a faded magenta line. So airspace beginning at 700 that abuts the 1,200 has that faded magenta line. So you can see here in this example how we have Class G from the surface up to 700 feet. The faded magenta line breaks it up, and then Class G goes up to 1,200 feet, which is the floor of your Class E airspace. So here's a faded magenta line surrounding an airport. Your lighter side, the Class E floor, starts at the 700 feet AGL. Then out to the darker side, everything outside is going to be 1,200 feet AGL floor. So let's build this airspace. So Class G around the airport is going to go from the surface up to 700 feet AGL, and then outside is going to be surface to 1,200 feet AGL. Then your Class E airspace around that airport is going to be 700 feet AGL up to 1,200 feet AGL. And then everything outside of that from 1,200 feet up to 17,999 MSL will be Class E. So here's how the Class E and Class G stack up to each other. And just like Class E airspace that starts at 1,200 feet AGL, a drone operator would not need ATC permission to fly in this type of Class E airspace that starts at the 700-foot AGL mark. And of course, you still would need a waiver if you can be flying above 400 feet. And the same rules apply for flying 400 feet above a structure. If that structure breaks into that Class E airspace, you're not going to need to have any special authorization. So in the other areas, Class E airspace is going to begin at the surface. Class E airspace beginning at the surface is depicted on a sectional chart by a dashed magenta line. And it's going to be surrounding an airport. So here we see that dashed magenta line. So your Class E starts at the surface. It's going to transition to a 700-foot AGL floor based on that magenta faded line. And then it's going to transition to a 1,200-foot AGL floor outside that magenta line. So let's build the airspace here for Class E. So surface to 700 feet, Class E around the airspace, around the airport. And then 700 to 1,200 foot AGL, you'll have another ring of Class E. And then everything above that 1,200 foot mark is going to be Class E, and that's going to go up to, but not including, 18,000 foot MSL. And so then everything outside of that Class E airspace is going to be Class G. ATC authorization is going to be required for surface areas of Class E. No person may operate a small unmanned aircraft within the lateral boundaries of the surface area of Class E airspace designated for an airport unless that person has prior authorization from ATC. Airspace beginning at 700 feet AGL that laterally abuts Class G airspace is depicted on a sectional chart by a faded magenta line with a Class G label. So it's going to be the same magenta line that abuts 1,200 feet AGL, but if it has a Class G label, it means the entire area is Class G, and the Class G airspace goes up to 14,500 MSL. So on your sectional chart, you'd have to look for the Class G label, and that's the indication that it goes up to 14,500. So inside the airspace, you have your Class E floor at 700 feet AGL, and then outside, you have your Class E floor at 14,500 MSL. So in this example here, we have this large area where Class G goes up to 14,500. We have two sections where the Class G goes up to 700 feet AGL, and then we have two little sections that go to 1,200 feet AGL. So this is how the 3D model would look. You have your faded magenta line with your Class G label. Your Class G is going to go up to 14,500. Your faded blue line, which indicates that Class G is going up to 14,500 and then 1,200. Your faded magenta line without the Class G label, which goes from 700 feet AGL to 1,200 feet AGL. Now, if your Class E airspace starts at other than the surface, 700 feet or 1,200 feet, it's depicted by a blue zipper with the altitude floor. So here it says 800 feet AGL. That's telling you the floor of the Class E airspace is set at 8,000. If the ceiling is less than 18,000 MSL, the value is preceded by the word ceiling. Right? So here it says ceiling 14,000 MSL. So this is what it would look like on a sectional chart. You see you have your blue zippered line, and it indicates that the floor of Class E is 7,500 MSL. And then the same rules apply. The ceiling would be 17,999 MSL. If you're looking at that blue faded line, it is going to indicate that you have your Class E floor at 14,500 and it goes up to 17,999. Also, we can see that there's a couple Federal Airways running through that. And so that floor is going to remain the same at 1,200, and it's going to go up to 17,999 MSL. And even though that Federal Airway cuts through a Class E airspace that has the floor of 7,500 feet MSL, it will still have a floor of 1,200. Class E airspace may be designated as extensions to Class B, C, D, and E surface areas. Class E airspace extensions begin at the surface and extend up to the overlying controlled airspace. So looking here at Lake Tahoe, we see the Class E surface area extension. If a line segregates the airspace of Class E surface, ATC approval is not required for that extension area. ATC approval is required for the Class E surface area around the airport, though. So it's all about whether there's a line breaking up those two airspace sections. So here's another area. We see it's a Class E extension area around a Class D airport. So this airport says C NOTAMs are the supplement for your Class D effective hours. So if we check Glacier Park International, we see that the Class D time is 1500 to 07 Zulu, and other times it's going to be Class E. So Class D, 1500 to 07 Zulu. We have our Class E extension areas that does not change based on time. So from 0701 to 1459 Zulu, that entire airport is going to be considered Class E. ATC authorization is required for that area around the airport, regardless of whether it's Class E or Class D. And then your extension area, ATC authorization is not going to be required. So let's take a look at this example here. We see we have our faded magenta line surrounding the airport, which puts our Class G airspace going up to 700 feet AGL. That entire area is going to be Class G. And then outside that line, we know that the Class G airspace is going to go to 1,200 feet AGL. So inside that faded magenta line, around the two airports, we have Class Echo airspace. And then up to 1,200 feet outside that area, all Class G. So above that, we're going to have Class Echo airspace, excluding the two areas by the faded blue lines and the Class G label. So that Class G airspace is going to extend up to 14,500. And then Class E is going to be everything surrounding those two areas. And then from 14,500 MSL to 17,999, that entire area is Class E. And then above that will be Class A. And then from flight level 600, all going to be Class E. All right, so here's your Class E area. And there's your Class G area. So 400 feet AGL is where you should be doing most of your drone operations, right? So if we're in this area, ATC authorization is not going to be required no matter where you're flying because you'll be in Class G, uncontrolled airspace. Let's take a look at another example. Here we have Coeur d'Alene Airport. We see we have a dashed magenta line. So we have a Class Echo surface area airport. We see that's going to go up to 700 feet AGL. So everything outside that airport area is Class G. On top of that, from 700 feet to 1,200 feet AGL, following the faded magenta lines, we see we have the Class E areas. And then everything outside of that Class E area up to 1,200 feet is going to be Class G. And then outside of that faded magenta line, 1,200 feet on upward up to 17,999 feet MSL will be Class E. So is ATC authorization going to be required for flying in the area around Coeur d'Alene Airport? Again, we see a note. It says see NOTAMs or the supplement for your Class E surface effective hours. So we have to check that to make sure we know when the time is for Class E. And here it says your Class E is continuous. So this entire area around the airport requires ATC approval. And so we have those two extension areas outside the airport, but there's no line segregating that airspace. So those two extension areas also require ATC approval. Let's review the Class G and E airspace. Make sure we understand everything. Class E airspace is the controlled airspace not classified as Class A, B, C, or D. And Class G airspace is the uncontrolled airspace not classified as A, B, C, D, or E. So it's pretty much everything else. Everything above flight level 600 is Class E. Your Class E floor starts at 14,500 MSL unless otherwise depicted, and it goes up to 17,999 MSL. The Class E floor starts at any specified altitude if depicted by a zippered blue line. Class E floor starts at 1,200 feet AGL if depicted by a faded blue line. Class E floor starts at 700 feet AGL if depicted by a faded magenta line. Class E floor starts at the surface if depicted by a dashed magenta line. Your federal airways, they're 8 nautical miles wide, 4 nautical miles from each side of the center line, and they're from 1,200 feet AGL up to 17,999 MSL. And everything else is going to be Class G. If you have a waiver to fly above 400 feet AGL, you do not need ATC approval to operate in Class E airspace apart from surface areas surrounding the airports. ATC authorization is required for Class E surface areas. ATC authorization is not required for surface area extensions. If you are operating 400 feet above a structure in Class E airspace, you do not need ATC approval. And thank you. If you need help getting your remote pilot certificate, visit tacavpro.com. I'll be there to help you out. Thanks for joining me.